So without further ado, we can begin with the next slide. So as Jade has said, Cameron or Cam is my name and fossils are my game. So I am a self-taught paleontologist and a science communicator from the state of Georgia. And I specifically study fossils from the Appalachian region. And I look how the Appalachian region has changed through time by studying its fossil record. And I really like to educate the community about Earth's history and about historical geology. Next slide, please. So when you think of Georgia, you definitely probably don't think of fossils. Georgia is known for a lot of really good places. It's known for a lot of good food, and it's where a lot of movies have been filmed and a lot of musicians have gotten their start. But in regards to its fossil record, it really isn't well known. It's not as popular as the western part of the United States, like Montana, Wyoming, places where we find really cool big dinosaurs. But nevertheless, Georgia has a fossil record that goes at least as back as 500 million years. It has a rock record that goes back at least 1.1 billion years. So we have a pretty good chunk of the Earth's history within this state. And in order to really understand what we have, Georgia is broken up into a variety of different places that we can find its fossils. So the first place, the yellow, is the rocks that were deposited during the during the Cretaceous period and onward. So we find a lot of our mammal fossils here. The green band represents Cretaceous rocks, so we find a lot of Cretaceous sediments, including dinosaur fossils. And then right where we see that greenish line there, which represents the Mesozoic, we have a place known as the fall line, which represents rocks that were deposited from the coastal region, and then rocks that were formed about 1.1 billion years ago, or a little bit younger than that. So that actually represents old crystalline rocks to our coastal or younger coastal sediment rocks. And around in the Piedmont region, which is the orange or red on this map here, represents rocks that are crystalline, so igneous and metamorphic rocks that are too old, they're too old for fossils. Now there are some stream cuts where you can find Pleistocene material, pieces of like mammals from the last ice age, but we don't have rocks on the surface that represents life. We don't have fossils that are in place in that region. So all of our rocks are going to be in that region. And it's actually where I am now. I'm in the Piedmont region. I've always lived in the Piedmont region. But once we travel out of the Piedmont, we get into the Blue Ridge. And the Blue Ridge also has those very old Precambrian rocks. But in the blue, up onto the corner here, is where we actually find our Paleozoic rocks. These are some of our oldest, this is where we're going to find our oldest fossils. So this includes things like trilobites, this includes sponges, corals, and things of that nature. So these are rocks from 500 million years up to younger to around 200 million years. And this is where we find our oldest fossils. And it's actually where I do most of my work. And so we'll actually see that kind of reflect in the presentation as we go further into time. So next slide, please. So we're going to be traveling back 500 million years. So I hope you relax. I hope you got some water, some snacks, because we are going to be traveling over 500 million years through Georgia's fossil record. Next slide. So during the Cambrian period, Georgia was positioned south of the equator. So that star represents where Georgia was through time. And actually, we're going to be following that star. You will actually see that that star, our position, or where Georgia is located, is actually going to change many times throughout as we start to travel through time. We actually have tidal deposits, and we actually have these carbonate rocks, limestones, and dolostone that get deposited in these ancient shallow seas. And these carbonates represent a variety of different formations that we see today on the sides of roads or in quarries, or even some of the building blocks that make up the buildings of Georgia. So we've got the Western quartzite, we've got the shady dolomite, we've got the Rome shale, we've got the Canasaga formation, and we also have the Knox group. So these are our various different types of Cambrian units that were deposited when Georgia was positioned south of the equator and it was under an ancient shallow sea. Next slide. So the Cambrian period is a very important time in Earth's history. It is known for the what we call the Cambrian explosion, which is a biological event. And it's where we start to see organisms, specifically animals, creating hard parts. And we call this biomineralization in paleontology and in geology. And this just simply means that animals are making their skeletons. They are secreting their skeletons of hard parts. So they're using various different types of minerals in the water to make hard exoskeletons. And this can be used for protection and other forms of ways of that nature. Next slide. So the first fossils that we actually get into in the Cambrian is these things called archaeocyathids. And they're kind of a debate among paleontologists. So the community, including myself, believes that these are actually fossil sponges. Some of them believe that they are completely different, but nevertheless, these are actually some of the oldest known fossils from the state of Georgia. And these are roughly about 516 million years old. In fact, when you find an archaeocyathid fossil anywhere you go, this is actually a great representation of what geologists call index fossils. So we can use these particular fossils to tell the age of rocks. So if you find an archaeocyathid fossil anywhere, it's kind of that marker that lets you know that you are in the earliest portion of the Cambrian. And so these fossils can be found in Cartersville, Georgia, which is where that red dot is. So again, as we start to travel through time, that red dot on the Georgia map lets us know where those fossils have been found and where they're located. And so these are some of the coolest fossils I really like. They're underappreciated. And I just think they're just some of the coolest fossils because they are actually the oldest stuff that you can find. Next slide. So we also have an early Cambrian unit known as the Rome Formation. The Rome Formation is a really interesting rock unit because it represents tidal deposits. And so those tidal deposits are represented in the rock record. And so we've got ripple marks that let us know that the ocean or the water was moving back and forth. And we also have mud cracks that let us know that the water was actually dried up by the sun and then it became a wet environment again. So we actually have those desiccation cracks or these mud cracks that are imprinted in the rocks. In the other side, in the Rome Formation, Alabama, we actually have early trilobites. And that's one of the things that I've wanted to look at for a long time is to see if we have these early Cambrian trilobites in the Rome Formation. So that's one of the projects that I want to do. But for right now, I have gone into the Rome Formation. I've only seemed to find trace fossils and sedimentary structures, no body fossils just yet. But there are body fossils in Alabama. Next slide. So this is actually where we get to the fossil-rich Cambrian unit called the Camasaga Formation. And the Camasaga Formation kind of represents this ancient sea that has these muds that got deposited off in shore. And these shales you basically can open them like the pages of a book. So you're splitting open a rock and you're splitting open that bedding plane. And on that bedding plane, you're opening up a story about 500 million years that are now inside of that shale bed. Next slide. So the things that you can find are trilobites. Trilobites are they're some of the coolest fossils, and it's one of the things or one of the fossils that kind of got me into wanting to be a paleontologist. Trilobites are so cool. If you ever follow me on social media, I do Trilobite Tuesday, and I post all different types of trilobites in my personal collection. And trilobites from Georgia are actually some of the very first fossils that I actually ever found back in 2016 when I got to collect in the Camasaga Formation. But trilobites in Georgia are quite interesting. In fact, the biggest trilobites that you can find are about 1 to 2 inches in length, which is actually quite rare. Most of the trilobite specimens that you can find in the Camasaga Formation are about a few centimeters, maybe 2 or 3 centimeters to about an inch. And that's very common for the fossil trilobites found in this formation. But some of them do get quite large. I have a specimen in my personal collection that's pushing to the length of 2 inches. Now, that might not be surprising to some other people who do like trilobites, but that's pretty big for the state of Georgia. Trilobites are arthropods. They have hard exoskeletons, and they lived on the ocean floor, eating detritus matter and other types of organisms. Next slide. So we also have a really interesting thing. We have soft-bodied preservation, which is very rare. Um, the Burgess Shale Formation is an extremely well-known unit, one of the most famous soft-bodied places, localities where you can find soft-bodied fossils. And Georgia does have soft-bodied fossils as well. In fact, the person who discovered the Burgess Shale and opened up the Burgess Shale Quarry, Charles Doolittle Walcott, has also spent some time in Georgia and Alabama. And some of these fossils are also represented within the Burgess Shale fauna. So we do actually have Burgess Shale type fossils that are found in Georgia. So we have a variety of sponges, we have a variety of brachiopods, and one of these things called hyoliths that are kind of closely related to mollusks. We have those, but they're also found in the Burgess Shale. So that's one thing that I really like to tie in with Georgia is we do actually have Burgess Shale type preservation in the state, which is really cool. And I hope we can find some other really neat soft body fossils in the future as we start to collect and study more of this formation. Next slide. So once we start to get into the mid-Cambrian, which is where those trilobites are from the Conchosaga Formation, we start to kind of transition from the Cambrian to Ordovician boundary. And this is actually where we start to see stromatolites. And stromatolites are trace fossils. They are the representations of growth of cyanobacteria. Now, stromatolites have been around for an extremely long time. The oldest stromatolites come from Australia and are probably around 2 to 3 billion years old. These stromatolites are a lot younger. These are around 497 million years old. But basically, it's cyanobacteria. They basically make this gooey substance, and sediment gets deposited on that gooey substance, and they start to grow up and up and up because they are photosynthesizers. They need the sun to survive, to convert into food. And so stromatolites actually show that growth, and we actually do find these growth series of stromatolite domes within the rocks in Northwest Georgia, specifically from the Copper Ridge Dolomite. And so we do actually have living stromatolites today. This is a very famous locality off the coast of Shark Bay, Australia, where you have hundreds of stromatolite domes that are still living today. So stromatolites have lived for about over 500 million years of Earth's history, and we still have them today. And they're also recorded in the Cambrian rocks of Northwest Georgia, specifically in Adairsville. Next slide. So we kind of get out of the Cambrian as we start to get into the Knox group there, the Copper Ridge Dolomite. And so now we start to transition into the Ordovician period. And again, we will definitely be covering this more, and we'll be talking about this more, but Georgia was still under a shallow sea south of the equator, and the Iapetus Ocean, that large ocean off the coast, actually started to close. And so we actually started to see another increase of biology. We call this the Great Ordovician Biodiversification Event. That's just a really big name for a biological event that we see in Earth's history, specifically in the Ordovician. You see an increase in brachiopods, which are these like shelled-like animals, echinoderms, like starfish and crinoids, bivalves, coral reefs, and again, trilobites. And the rocks that were deposited during this time included the Chickamauga limestone, and the Squatchy Formation. Next slide. So this is kind of gives you a look of what the Ordovician period kind of looked like. So these things that kind of look like flowers are crinoids, and we'll be getting into those a little bit later. But they have a stalk, and you see crinoids living today. Some of the top predators are these orthocones, these cephalopods. These are some of the top predators during that time. We also have trilobites living in these ancient seas, and the abundance of coral reefs. Coral reefs really started to make an appearance during this time. We see the abundance of algae mounds and sponges and things of that nature. So this kind of gives you a representation of what the Ordovician looked like over around 450 million years ago. Next slide. So this is a chunk of limestone from the Chickamauga limestone formation, and the still fossil here is a bryozoan. Bryozoans are animals. They're colonial animals. So in those little small holes there is the zooecium, and it's where those little animals kind of lived. Think of it as like an apartment complex, and that's where those animals lived in those tiny little holes. So that kind of gives you a representation of what a bryozoan looked like. Next slide. We also have brachiopods. Brachiopods are really cool. They're one of the most common fossils that you can find in the Paleozoic. They are not as common as today because of the abundance of clams and bivalve type animals living today. But back during the Paleozoic, brachiopods made up entire communities of these oceans. And so we find a whole community of brachiopods from this time. Next slide. In the Ordovician rocks of northwest Georgia, specifically from the Squatchy Formation, we do see tidal deposits, and we see the abundance of trace fossils. So we see animals making burrows and tracks and trails in the soft sediments. And on the left picture is a slab of sandstone that actually has worm burrows. And then on the next slide, I'm sorry, on the next photo is a starfish resting place. So this starfish was actually resting and then it moved. And so we actually have that trace represented in the shales in northwest Georgia. So this is pretty cool. We actually do have a starfish that was resting on a tidal flat. Next slide. We actually also have crinoids. Crinoids, again, as we looked in that picture of what the Ordovician ocean looked like, crinoids are very common fossils. They typically are only represented by their stems. Typically, the diagram here shows the red pointing to the columnal, which is typically what you'll find of crinoids. But there are some occasions where you could find the cup on the top portion of these crinoids. Though rare, you can find the tops of these things. Crinoids typically fall apart after death. So you'll only see their stems represented in the rocks that make up the Paleozoic. Crinoids are still living today, but they're not as abundant as they were in the Paleozoic. Next slide. So during this time, a volcanic arch collided into North America, and it created this large volcanism, these super volcanoes. And there was volcanic ash that got deposited in these ancient seas. And this clay, this ash kind of eroded and kind of transformed into this clay called bentonite. And so we can actually use this clay layer that used to be volcanic ash, and we can date that. And we can be able to tell when this volcanism was happening during this particular part of Earth's history. And it so happened to around 452 to 453 million years ago. So we can still see these bentonite layers that are sandwiched between shales and limestones in northwest Georgia along Ringgold, Georgia. We can still go into the rock record and see that ancient volcanic event that actually happened around 452 to 453 million years ago. Next slide. So now we kind of transition into the Silurian period. Not much has really changed. The life was still very, very similar as from the Ordovician to the Silurian. Specifically in Georgia, there were definitely large expanses of that sea and other communities and sea life around the world. But in Georgia, nothing really much has changed from the Ordovician fauna to the Silurian fauna. Next slide. But in northwest Georgia, specifically around Dade County or Trenton, Georgia, we do actually have fossils. So we actually have a community of variety of different types of invertebrate fossils from the Red Mountain Formation. This fossil on the very far left is a brachiopod fossil. Again, a very common fossil that you will see in Paleozoic type rocks. We have horn corals, Rugose corals, definitely make quite a big appearance in the Ordovician, but they still remain quite common in the Silurian as well. If you find a coral fossil in place in a rock, kind of lets you know that that particular environment was an ancient sea. These are kind of these um, indicators of an ancient shallow sea over hundreds of millions of years. So if you find a coral, kind of lets you know that that environment was once an ancient sea. And we also still have trilobite fossils, though not as common as the trilobites that are from the Cambrian. We actually do find some Silurian trilobites that are found bits and pieces. This one is an exceptional specimen. It's complete. Um, and this is a really cool fossil of a trilobite that was discovered in the Red Mountain Formation. Next slide. So the Devonian period is a period that we really don't have too much of in Georgia. We have rocks um, from the Chattanooga Shale in the Amuchi Church, but we don't really have fossils in those rocks. Fossils are actually quite scarce. The Chattanooga Shale is a very interesting type of formation that is outcrops in Tennessee, Alabama, and Georgia. And this is when the oceans were kind of in this stage of black, gooey, organic material was being deposited in these ancient seas. And there wasn't too much life in these rocks. So this kind of represents an environment where there was very low oxygen in that environment. So we really don't see too many fossils. Now we do see conodonts, which are these eel-like animals. So basically conodonts are the pieces or the jaws of these eel type of animals living in these ancient seas. Conodonts go as far as the Cambrian. I wish I had a picture to kind of show you what they look like, but if you ever get the chance to look them up online, they're actually really good for biostratigraphy. So we can use these jawed eel-like things from the Ordovician and from the Devonian, and we can kind of give a representation of where you are in geologic time. I believe, or the oil industry uses these types of fossils. Next slide. So now that we're out of the Devonian period and we really didn't have too many fossils there, now we start to jump back into a period where we actually do have abundant fossils. So here in North America, the Carboniferous is broken down into two parts. The lower portion of the Carboniferous here is called the Mississippian, and then the upper portion of the Carboniferous here is called the Pennsylvanian. Now, the Mississippian period, we have the abundance of carbonate rocks, things like limestones. We actually have silicious cherts as well, and it was covered under this warm, shallow sea. And this is actually where we start to see the assemblage of Pangea, that really, really big supercontinent, one of the largest supercontinents to ever exist. Pangea started to assemble during this time. And during the Carboniferous, the upper portion of the Carboniferous, or what we call the Pennsylvanian, Georgia was part of these deltaic swamps. And Nova Scotia has a lot of these. We'll kind of get into that kind of comparison in a little bit. Next slide. So this is what these lower Carboniferous oceans look like. This is what the Mississippian period is very known for. We see a high abundance of crinoids. In fact, most of the crinoids that you may see online probably come from the Carboniferous. We see an incredible abundance of these things in Carboniferous rocks. In fact, there are whole limestones that are made up of these bits and pieces of crinoids. So they're very common fossils. We see an abundance of corals. We see an abundance of echinoderms specifically. What we don't see that much of are trilobites. Trilobites started to decline during this time. So we only see a very small portion of crinoids. I'm sorry, a very small portion of trilobites during this time. Next slide. So I've done quite a bit of collecting up in this section here in the Carboniferous. And so this is me looking at collecting fossil sponges from the Fort Payne Formation in Rome, Georgia, and the Lavender Shale member of the Fort Payne. Next slide. And we actually start to see an increase in these specific types of brachiopods called the spiriferids, or the angel-winged brachiopods. They made a quite big appearance in the Devonian. Then the Mississippi, and they went crazy. So we see a high abundance of these types of brachiopods. This was discovered in the Carboniferous rocks, probably likely Fort Payne or something very similar in age. But the cool thing about this fossil brachiopod is that it's been replaced by quartz. So brachiopods, their shells are composed of calcium carbonate. But during this time, their exoskeletons have been replaced by quartz. So this is kind of what you're looking at. This blue kind of mineral has been replaced by silica over time. It's not the original material that brachiopod was made out of. It makes it much durable for preservation as well. Next slide. Again, here we go back again with the echinoderms, the crinoids. Again, like I said, whole rocks are composed of their bits and pieces. So crinoids are very common in the Carboniferous rocks in the state of Georgia. We also have a really cool mineral called agate. Agate is a cryptocrystalline quartz. It is composed of these tiny microscopic crystals that forms these banding layers. And this is a very common mineral that you can find in specifically around in the Fort Payne Formation. And this one in particular is called Somerville lace agate. It is a very common rock or stone that gets mined for jewelry purposes, and it's beautiful. I've seen specimens like this that get polished and then get cut. They're gorgeous. So this is a very well-known mineral that you can find in Carboniferous rocks, specifically around the Chattooga County in Georgia. Again, here we go with the corals. We see an abundance of horn and rugose corals as well in this particular period. Next slide. So hang on, we have sharks too. So as you can see, I probably haven't brought up a single vertebrate animal in this presentation just yet. And that's because vertebrate material is very rare in the Paleozoic. Until we start to get into the Carboniferous, we do see an abundance of vertebrate material in the southeast, specifically from these rocks, specifically chondrichthyine fish. So chondrichthyine just simply means that fish that are composed of a cartilaginous skeleton. So if you kind of mess with your ear, it's very bendy, and it's because of that material that it is composed of, which is called cartilage. Sharks have the same material as sharks have the same material in their skeletons. They're not composed of bone. And cartilage hardly ever fossilizes in the fossil record, though there are some occasions. The hard parts are typically the things that get preserved. And this is one of the things that I've been a part of. There was a chondrichthyine tooth, a shark tooth, that was described, that was found in the Fort Payne Formation, Lavender Shell member of the Fort Payne Formation in Rome, Georgia. And Dr. Brad DeLine found it. He's a good friend of mine. He's at the University of West Georgia, and he's a geology professor there. He studies crinoids. But when he was on this trip looking for crinoid material, he actually found this tooth. And I and a couple of other paleontologists, specifically Dr. Ryan Schell and Dr. J.P. Hotnet, kind of came together and realized that this was actually an important fossil that needs to be written on and published. So this paper was published and last year in October, and it's actually one of the oldest chondrichthyine fossils from the state of Georgia. And this is actually one of the oldest occurrences of a shark called Stethecanthus, known from Georgia. This particular shark has not been found in the state of Georgia before. And so by looking at the morphology of the tooth and the way that it's preserved, we can actually identify that this shark actually belonged to a genus, Stethecanthus. So this is actually the first Stethecanthus fossil from the state of Georgia. So there's new things happening all the time. And so we're still trying to find shark material in Carboniferous rocks around Alabama and around in Georgia. So these are very common things that we like to look at and study. So specifically, this is one of the very first papers that I ever published, and it was on sharks. And this is continuous research that I'm working on right now. Next slide. So this is what the Pennsylvanian part of the Carboniferous looks like. We have these ancient swamp type of environments, these deltaic swamps during the Carboniferous period or during the Pennsylvanian. And you have these large lycopod plants that were growing, these things called lepidodendron and these giant club mosses. You had dragonflies, ancestors of dragonflies, that had a 2 foot long wingspan. We had big arthropods, like Arthroplora, for example, that could reach to around 10 feet long. These were huge. And it's because of the oxygen levels. These lycopods were so big, these club mosses are so big that they actually made up canopies in these ancient Carboniferous forests, which produced a lot of oxygen. And animals, such as the insects, for example, can take in that much oxygen and get big. So this is what they were doing. This is why you had 2 foot long or 2 foot winged um, griffin flies, and you had Arthroplora, this big millipede-like animal that was about 10 feet long. Next slide. So we can find that exact same type of those exact same type of environment that we saw a picture of before, and it's now in the rock record. And so we have these big scale trees or scale club mosses called lepidodendron. We actually have the roots of these scale trees called stigmaria, and then we have an abundance of plant fossils that can be found in rocks, specifically from the Crab Orchard Mountain Formation. And we kind of get the boundary between the Mississippian and the Pennsylvanian. So we actually do find that boundary. Those rocks are also found in Nova Scotia, though they may be a little bit different in regards to their fauna. We do see very similar transitions as we start to get into the upper portion of the Carboniferous. Next slide. And we also have these tetrapod trackways. And again, Nova Scotia, going right back to Nova Scotia, that relevance. It actually also has, or Georgia also has those footprint sites. And Alabama is very well known for this as well. There's a specific site in Alabama known as the Stephen C. Minkin site, and it preserves these ancient trackways from these early tetrapods, either from amphibians or from reptiles. Nova Scotia has a very similar thing where you actually guys have not you guys don't just only have the trace fossils, but you even have the body fossils of these ancient reptiles and amphibians. Georgia's not so lucky; we just have the trace fossils. But we actually do have these footprints made by tetrapods found in Chattooga County. This is just a replica. I'm not exactly sure what the original specimen is, but it is pretty cool that we actually do have these ancient tetrapod tracks imprinted in the shales up in Northwest Georgia. Next slide. So unfortunately, we don't have any Permian, Triassic, or Jurassic fossils on the surface or either on the subsurface. We do have drill cores that were taken from the coastal plains that are from that late Triassic, early Jurassic rift basins. And so during this time, there's a map here below that kind of represents how the Atlantic Ocean was actually being formed. Now, in the rocks near Georgia and up and along Nova Scotia, you've got that rift basin, but that rift basin failed. And then there was more rifting that eventually created the Atlantic Ocean. So we actually do have those filled rift basins from the east coast of North America and the east coast of Africa when those were starting to split apart due to the breakup of Pangea. In those coastal plain sediments in South Georgia, we do have conglomerates and siltstones and calcite nodules that were being pulled up from those ancient sediments that were deposited. So we do have that record on the subsurface. We just don't have it on the surface. And in the Piedmont region where I am, we actually do see intrusions of these igneous rocks, what we call diabase or dolerite, that kind of formed in these cracks when Pangea was starting to split apart. So we actually do have that recorded in the rock record. We just don't have fossils from this time period, unfortunately. Next slide. Now, in the Cretaceous period, it's a different story. we find the first coastal sediments in this time. So this is when Georgia was under an ancient shallow sea still, but there were also coastal sediments that got deposited. Now, a variety of different animals were living in this types of environment, and you had a variety of different types of sediments that were also formed during this time. So you had the Utah Formation, you had the Cusetta Sand, you have the Blufftown Formation, you have the Ripley Formation, and then deposited at the very end of the Cretaceous period, you actually have the Providence Sand. We do find dinosaurs in these rocks. So we'll get to that in a moment. And we actually do have these giant alligatorid type animals living in Georgia, and we'll get to that in the next slide. So in this ocean, we actually find a variety of marine invertebrates and vertebrates. So we find these large monitor lizard type animals called mosasaurs, which were some of the top predators during this time. We find these long necked marine reptiles called plesiosaurs, and we find bony fish. We find large turtles like Archelon and Protostega. And we also find a variety of invertebrates as well. Lots of oysters and clams and things like that. We find ammonites. And in this little green section below is where we find the outcropping of Cretaceous rocks. So last year, I spent some time in Lumpkin County, Georgia, looking at some of these Cretaceous sediments and collecting some of these invertebrates that were living in this ancient sea during the Cretaceous period. Next slide. So again, we have a variety of different types of fossils. We have ammonites, which are these shelled squid-like animals, basically squids with a hard shell. Some ammonites can get very large, but typical ammonites around Georgia get, maybe about 2 or 3 or 4 inches across, not too big. This is one of the largest ammonites I've seen, probably about maybe 6, 7 inches across. We also have sharks. We have a variety of different types of vertebrate animals that were living in that time. Sharks were very common. You can find shark teeth in some of these Cretaceous sediments. These are sharks called Scapanorhynchus, Tixianus, that are found in the Blufftown Formation. And we also have bony fish as well, one called Xiphactinus. Xiphactinus is well known from rocks in Kansas. If you've ever seen a fish within a fish, or maybe possibly look that up, you'll see that there's a Xiphactinus skeleton eating a much smaller fish called Gilchis. And those fossils are very, very common and very famous in the western part of the United States. But we actually do see Xiphactinus fossils from the state of Georgia as well. They're just not complete skeletons like Kansas has. Next slide. We also have dinosaurs. I know. We've traveled over 500 million years, and now we're just getting into dinosaurs. We do have dinosaurs. The problem is that we don't have any good complete skeletons. The dinosaur fossils that are found within the state of Georgia are what we call bloat and float carcasses. So basically, you had a dinosaur that died on the coast. The tide swept the animal away, so they were basically castaways. And you had sharks and other animals tearing the skeleton apart, and whatever remained of that animal got sent to the bottom of the ocean and got preserved as fossils. And so that's what you'll typically see in this case around the eastern part of the United States are bloat and float carcasses of dinosaurs, their remains. We've got ancestors of Tyrannosaurus rex called Appalachiosaurus. We've got duck-billed dinosaurs like Lothlorithon, another specific dinosaur that was found in Alabama and Georgia, found in the Ripley Formation. And we actually have these dinosaurs called Ornithomimosaurs. Ornithomimids are theropod dinosaurs, but they're probably omnivorous dinosaurs. If you've ever seen the movie Jurassic Park, they were very famous. If you've ever seen the scene where Tim says they're flocking this way and they're coming up the valley, that's kind of what you're looking at. These types of these bird mimic dinosaurs called ornithomimids, and these are just a cast of a couple of fossils discovered in the same formation in Mississippi. So we actually do find the same types of dinosaur fossils in Mississippi and in Georgia and in Alabama. Next slide. This was likely the apex predator. We had an animal called Deinosuchus. Deinosuchus was a large crocodilian-like animal that lived off the coast of Georgia. This animal was big. We find a variety of different types of remains, including teeth. We find their bony armor called osteoderms. We find pieces of their vertebrae and skull. And we don't have any complete skeletons, unfortunately, of this animal. All we have of their isolated bits and pieces of remains. The most common fossils that you can find of Deinosuchus are their teeth. Their teeth are quite numerous. And this was an animal that got big. This was a crocodile that could eat dinosaurs. And so we find their remains along the Cretaceous sediments in Lumpkin County and in Stewart County, Georgia. Next slide. In Texas, the biggest size specimens of Deinosuchus are found in the Aguja Formation. This belongs to the genus Deinosuchus and the species Rio Grandensis from the Aguja Formation in West Texas. And this is actually a crocodile jaw. The right is a crocodile jaw, and the left is a Deinosuchus jaw. Now you can see how big these things could have gotten. So you're just looking at the side view of that jaw, and it would have been much, much bigger. So we're talking about an animal that could have grown to at least 40 feet, 35 to 40 feet. That is an enormous crocodile. And we're talking about an animal that weighed to at least 5 tons. This was an enormous creature that were living off the coast of Georgia and were eating dinosaurs. So this was probably one of the top predators in the state of Georgia. Next slide. Now, during the late Cretaceous, there was something that happened, a mass extinction. An asteroid hit the Yucatan Peninsula off the Gulf of Mexico and obliterated life. And this is one of the more famous mass extinctions that we see in Earth's history, and it's the most well-studied one. We actually have the boundary. We actually don't have like the iridium or anything like that, but we have that separation between later Cretaceous sediments from the Providence Sand all the way up to the Clayton Formation. The Clayton Formation is Paleocene, or the age of mammals, and then the Providence Sand is the age of dinosaurs, the later part of the Cretaceous. So we do see that separation in time. And the fossils are quite different too. In the Providence Sand, we see more or less more Cretaceous type of invertebrates. And then in the Clayton Formation, we see a shift in Paleogene invertebrates. So we actually do see that boundary in the state of Georgia. And we do see a change in invertebrate life as well. So this is actually a clam fossil known as Vernicardia wilcoxensis from the Clayton Formation. And it's only known from the Paleogene sediments. So that kind of lets you know that we are in rocks after the age of dinosaurs, somewhere between 60 million years ago or so. Next slide. We see after the age of dinosaurs, we see a variety of different types of organisms, vertebrates and invertebrates. So in the Eocene rocks, specifically from the Blue Bluff Formation in Burke County, we find early whales, whales with these back legs. Now, when you look at this animal, you definitely don't see any whale here, but this was an ancient whale or an ancestor of whales that existed around 50 or 40 million years ago. This is what we call Georgia cetus volcatensis, and I believe this should be the state fossil of the state of Georgia. The state fossil of the state of Georgia is just a random shark tooth. Boo. Let's vote to get Georgia cetus as our state fossil. This is such a cool fossil. We have an early whale, and it's one of the oldest known whales, I want to say in the Southeast, or in the United States, rather. We also have another whale called Basilosaurus. These are fossil whales that got to at least 30 to 40 feet long. This one, Georgia cetus, was probably around maybe 13, 14 feet, but not as big as Basilosaurus cetoides. This thing would have been massive. And its fossils have been recognized specifically from Alabama and in Louisiana. but their fossils were also found in Egypt, in Wahi al-Hitan, or the Valley of the Whales. And so we can kind of compare those fossils from Egypt and now, and see what we can look at. We have a variety of different types of fossils and rocks that were deposited in the Oligocene as well. Next slide. We see Pleistocene megafauna. We see from the Miocene, we actually do see large toothed sharks. The very famous one called Carcharodon megalodon. We find their teeth all the time along the Savannah River in the state of Georgia. So these are fossil shark's teeth that sometimes get washed up from dredge piles, and we can find their teeth today. And this is me holding a shark tooth or a megalodon tooth from the Mississippi Museum of Natural Science Museum collections. This tooth is about 5 to 6 inches, massive shark. We have a variety of land vertebrate animals, including giant ground sloths. We see those. We see capybara, which are only known in South America, but they got their start in North America. We see peccary fossils. We see bats. We see jaguar fossils. We see an incredible diversity of Pleistocene megafauna. We see mammoths and mastodons, and just an incredible array of vertebrate life from the Pleistocene. Next slide. So now we've reached to the point where we have traveled over 500 million years through Earth's history, or 500 million years through Georgia's fossil record. And one of the things that I really like doing is educating the public, because it is very important to educate the public, not just on Earth's history, but what's in your backyards. Most people don't know that we've got dinosaur fossils here. Most people don't even know that we actually have fossils in the state of Georgia. And it's not really well taught in a lot of schools. And so one of the things that I like doing is bringing my personal collection and talking to the general public about what's in our own backyards. And I feel like that brings a lot of us close to home, because we can hear and we can learn about fossils from other countries and in other states all day long. But when you actually focus on paleontology or natural history in your own backyards, it means something to the community. And that's one of the things that I really like doing. I do in-person outreach and I do virtual outreach on this particular subject matter. And this will inspire so many different kids to get in, not just in paleontology, but in natural history as well. You have this experience that can create biologists, that can create engineers, that can create geneticists. So these are a variety of different things we can learn about the history of the planet, and will inspire the next generation of upcoming people in the STEM fields. Next slide. So I'm going to have to leave you with this. I want to thank all of these various different people for contributing to this presentation, from the video, from the photos to the information. And I have worked with all of these people here on this list. And I really want to appreciate everybody that contributed to tuning into this talk. And if you have any questions for me, I would love to answer them.